Dunga se dan digi tuya delia tang zo da chi ngwe tunye dene digi tuya da an kanga se yungu re de ine zo nga zo da dunga ya di gu zo de karite ni ngo sa nga zo samno da ne dang ma xin we yin de yungu re se de za da nga zo ge dunga se dan digi tuya ki tablam dia nga zo semla ya gyuwa da je samno gyuwa da de ni chi ge ni su ji 무인에서도 하고 왔지. 근데 삼물력 교와 다제 도신 디기 주야다 동아세고 그래서. 근데 자당 저기 삼물날이야 곰자에다 삼물당당 같이 당고를라네 다 되네기 삼다다릭 망부유베 나네다 조로지다 쉬베네다 뇌중 코발레 아니 코발레 괜토네 델라 타르바세 토부도 셈비기 타르바 토드게 삼바 뇌중 기오레스 곰보레스 아니 되네 대야 수수지부 안에 타바 톱되와 마인바 심전 탐제 라나신 디기되바 동안미되바 지바인자 심전 탐제 동안에 저고 오래 제산티 심전 탐제기도노다 산요고파 토바쇼 셈비게 자쇼 셈기아레 디 삼당 오래세 다 되네게 다 셈게바 잠게다 산요고파 톱투그레스네 톱투고 말에서 안에 가르고그레스네 녀모바 빵고고레 녀모바 빵야레 녀보 는 양답에 따와 동의도 배셔라도 공고고래 디마금나 안에 녀모바 빵투고 말에 디인자 상여고 톱투고 말에 디인자 또 양답에 따와 동의도 배셔라고 공고래서 나 디숨들이 양한 저게 롭장제 디야곰제 냠는 제고래서지 디네 제발에 때네 양한 저 고려 동화 타달래 저 투야다 안도 동화 차상 세 투야 디기 띵이 되어 쭉 투야 되는 거래서지 나 디인자 저 디고를 마
Good morning. We started a couple of days ago looking at this text, the three principal aspects of the path. And the reason we're looking at this text is because ourselves individually, just like all sentient beings, have a deep inner yearning for freedom of pain and misery and to experience lasting, stable happiness. And this is our overriding or our underlying motivation for all our endeavors. In order to achieve a state of lasting happiness, we do require favorable material circumstances. But these aren't primary. No matter how good one's material circumstances are, we know that we still experience mental pain and anguish. Our happiness, therefore, primarily depends on our mental attitude, primarily depends on our way of thinking. So therefore, to be able to eliminate suffering and attain happiness, we have to transform our way of thinking. In particular, we have to understand reality. We have to understand reality in order to experience happiness. And how to do so? The Buddha Dharma presents many paths to cultivate within ourselves. There are many steps of training presented in a graduated sequence to achieve lasting happiness. And these are condensed into three principal aspects. The first of which is definite emergence. Definite emergence arises through reflecting on the faults of cyclic existence, coming to see how suffering pervades samsara, and giving rise thereby to a determination to emerge from the suffering realms of samsara and attain a state liberated, free from suffering. That is the first of the principal aspects. Thereafter, one focuses one's attention from one's own state within cyclic existence and recognizes that each and every other single sentient being without exception is in the same position, yearning for happiness, but remaining bound within the suffering realms of samsara due to the same reason, their own afflicted minds. And in this way, we generate compassion for their suffering, giving rise to a strong, overwhelming wish, may all beings develop a state that is freed from suffering. And conjoined with this, we generate love. May all beings attain a state of lasting, stable happiness. And we develop this further into the determination to become a Buddha, so that we can lead all beings to achieve their own enlightenment. And this is the mind of bodhicitta. And this is the second of the three principal aspects. These two, though, on their own, are insufficient to lead to the attainment of our aspiration thus far developed, that of Buddhahood. One has to also abandon what holds us back from becoming a Buddha, what holds us back from realizing reality. And that is our own afflictions, together with their seeds. So these have to be abandoned, and they are abandoned through cultivating the corrective view, the wisdom realizing emptiness. And the correct view is the third principal aspect. So all the trainings of the path are condensed into these three principal aspects, and that's what we're continuing to look at in our text.
Jambada Ninja Lasam said, Lasam Namda said, Disum Jambada Ninja Lasam Namda said, Disum Gombale Dene, and it Jajusum Kitu Gigores, Chazanda Jajusum Kiela Niela, Manzuki, Jambada Ninja, Lasam de Gongo or essay on those sinners sooner.
The mind of enlightenment, bodhicitta, this comes about in dependence on causes. Without the required causes being accumulated, bodhicitta cannot be generated. So therefore it's imperative that we first come to recognize clearly the causes that will lead to the attainment of bodhicitta, and thereafter we will be armed with the required knowledge to be able to cultivate bodhicitta within our own continuums. What we need to do to generate bodhicitta is independent on our prior training in definite emergence. We now need to shift the focus of our attention from our own suffering state to that of others. So we need to shift our attention to the situation that others find themselves in. And on that basis, we can engage in the cultivation of the primary causes that will lead to bodhicitta. Love and compassion, developed, or we can call them together, the altruistic attitude. But primarily, the causes that lead to the attainment of bodhicitta are love and compassion.
Zada 저기 잠바스네 심자듬지 대화대 되나 sembi기 삼로디 잠바스 고미아들이 저 니제라네 심자든지 동안라 자고도 자나 sembe 삼로지 니지지 다 하삼나다스도 심자든지 대화대 덴바다 동안다 자와대 니지긴 세베 삼다데 하삼세 가지고 안디 숨디 고모 그래서 그러와.
I didn't express it, the translation didn't express it so clearly earlier, but there are three primary causes. So now, these three primary causes in brief: love, compassion, and the altruistic attitude of universal responsibility. Then the meaning in brief is, love is this strong wish, may all beings abide in a state of lasting, stable happiness. Compassion is the wish, may all beings abide in a state freed of suffering. And then the altruistic attitude of universal responsibility comes about independent on the prior cultivation of love and compassion, where the practitioner takes as their own personal responsibility to ensure that each being attains a state of lasting happiness, freed of suffering. In other words, the practitioner, having generated love and compassion, now no longer is content to leave it at a mere aspiration, but is determined to fulfill that aspiration themselves. That is the altruistic attitude of universal responsibility.
Tanda simjan thamje dewada dena simbe jamjiki jambatye da simje dunga da dana ni bigi inji kiebala ane simje thamje la dewada meba de mathong ba na de simje thamje dewada gogudu simbe samla li marwa chisa simje thamje da dewada den gogudu simbe samla lebala khargu simje le dewa meba de thonggu ko ha ko korwa chisa simje thamje da dunga da dana simbe samlo de kiebala simjenle dunga 옛날 되어봐도 통고고로 지금 dunga 강아 시고 지어봐 통바이나 어디 강아 딜레데 타고도 선배 삼리고 얼마도 편이 강아 여봐 이네 마통바이나 아 강아 딜레 타고도 선배 삼리고 말아 편이 디기 고야디 뭐 강아 여나 디기 매봐래 지금 디기 고고 여봐도 마통바이나 디기데 된다 선배 삼리고 말아 디네 인자 잠바다 저와 니지 깨알아 당보 가르 삼당고라서 심전 될야 아니 강아 가르도 가르스 강아 체계도 디네 누가 가네 가르 연구도 세비 도시는 건도 누가 연하되게 봐 심주제 제바치도 아 누가 여바다 세부하고 다 누가 되네 연구도와 누가디 유가네실 연구를 해서야 봐 제바치도 dunga-diki yu-dine shili yungu-re sayadi. Du-shina samna tanga-du, tonga-du, yu-dine dunga-dine dede yungu-du. Dunga-yu-dine shili dunga-yigidu sembe tonga-du, anda dunga-de konzole dewa-zawa yu-ni mindu-shisa, da dewa-de dena sembe sam, dewa-de gogu-du sembe samla-chiki-kili-gurwa. Shisa dunga-diki tonga-du, ata dunga-de dra-gogu-du sembe dra-na sembe samla-chiki-nili-gurwa. Dine-za jam-niji-kiya-la, manzu semjen-liya, dunga gana garsi yunguyo ba, dunga yu garal dine yunguyo ba, desu bhasam tangu reyase wata.
To give rise to love and compassion of the strength that is required in order for bodhicitta later to be generated takes particular training, because love and compassion, whilst we refer to this and experience it in our everyday life, the love and compassion that leads to bodhicitta needs to be of a particular strength. And for one's wish for beings to experience a state of lasting happiness, in other words, to generate the mind of love, one needs to recognize that beings are suffering. Similarly, to give rise to the mind of compassion, may all beings be freed of suffering, one has to recognize that beings are suffering. And this recognition of suffering, if it is superficial, so too will the resulting love and compassion. The stronger the recognition that beings are suffering, the stronger will be the wish, may beings be freed of suffering, may beings abide in happiness. So therefore, if we have the aspiration to give rise to actual love and compassion, it is indispensable that we come to recognize the true nature of samsara, the depth and breadth of suffering that all beings are experiencing, not just at a coarse level, but down to the subtlest of levels, and come to recognize how beings have since beginning as time and will continue to suffer in this way, life after life, in an uncontrolled manner, as long as they remain bound in samsara. So we have to again vividly come to recognize suffering and its causes in order to give rise to a transformative aspiration for beings to be freed of suffering and its causes, and to abide in a state of lasting happiness through the accumulation of those particular causes. And again, in order to give rise to genuine and powerful love and compassion, this only comes about in relation to the strength and depth of our realization of suffering.
가상 슈바 나진 가상 그 슈바레라 다 동아 심절레 동아 되는데 용거리 해야지 그래서 마 저기 다 심절레 가지고 동아 규 동아 사다 잡아주지 동아 레파 타야메바 기디나 가브리엘이야 둔돌기 가브리엘이야 만족이 냐와다 되네 가브리엘에 되네기 밀기 되네이나 둥하기 나는 균에 타야메바 균에 용거레스 니규 가르치는 용거레라는 둥하디 요한디기 되네 도와 선배기 제바제야 당아서 디 용거라 내야미 끼기 두삼다네 내야미 끼인제네 베 네바 미 수볼 나두기 맹가나네 나자가제 요레 나지유디게 데니 나지디네 강아 요레사다 하나가지 밀 삼다 디네기 안지게 가시야 예 류길 나제메나 차베 둥아다 차위 둥아 강아 안사야 도야 메베 강아 두로게 메베 강아 데데 시유 점리나리아 밀레 데네 시요레사다 안 가실이야 한지 셈마기바 지 수보 사야 도야다 안 수보 타다야냐 셈마기바 지베 강아 안지 소수기 되비기 되는데 마주비가 강아 제 소수기 다야지 잘라다 규절한테 한 현다게 초조야다想야게 왕유 제왕 다야게 되네 동아 되네 두슨 되네 두스비 동아디기 파자 쳐봐 뭐 쳐봐지 다디나진다 셈절랑 가지고 두도 통수스기 받아 동아딘데 요와서 되네기 동아디게 삼다야다 대대수 다 되네 되네 그 대수 규 가를 때는 용구래서도 당 안서 자외네 안서기 풍보 뒤유배 때네 될라 때네 용거래서 지난데 풍보디 주위에 가르고 두고라서네 레라 때는 두고래 레디 유가를 때는 것도 녀만 받는 용거래서 녀만 받에 가르치는 저 자위 다세 마리 받는 이거래서 다세 마리 봐 가상하다 다세 마리 봐서 짜게 강반하시 마 디나리 봐 취시 배 가고 니수 왜 니수도 마통와 마리브 문베나 팁되지 마리브 디기엔제네 두스는 가도 동안 거래서 제가 데네 동안 용도 데네 섬전에게 동아들도 섬제다 콘솔레 대와 남야민도 제가 다 섬전 지실 디기지 고고도 섬비 디기데 되나 섬비게 데네 잠바지야다 데네 동아들레다 타고도 동아 유다 제발라 마타나 타미나 타나 섬비게 동아 자나 섬비게 다 인지기야디 두스전에 공고를 해서 돼 당가서 가서 디고 쉬사버려
So again, in order to generate love and compassion, this will come about only in dependence or in relation to the strength of love and compassion that we generate will be in direct relation to the strength and depth that we understand suffering and its causes. And yesterday, we looked at suffering and its causes. We spoke about the threefold division of suffering in brief, that of the suffering of physical and mental pain, the suffering of transient happiness, and all-pervasive suffering. We can reflect on this by recalling what we have experienced ourselves and what we observe in the world, looking at the suffering of humans and animals to start, recognizing the tremendous suffering that we observe and have experienced ourselves. People suffer from being ill, and when the illness is serious, those around them suffer too. People suffer from poverty, struggling to feed themselves, struggling to fulfill their responsibility to their families. And even those who have comfortable material conditions, we also know that they don't experience any mental peace either. Whilst materially they are comfortable, their minds, like others, are full of anguish. And this is a similar situation, of course, for animals, but compounded by their lack of intelligence. When animals experience illness, other than perhaps eating something, all they can do is stand and hope that it passes and they don't die. Moreover, they suffer from the constant fear of being caught by a more powerful predator and eaten alive. So thinking like this, we can see on a coarse level the sufferings that beings experience and recognize, especially when we include both the physical and the mental difficulties that beings experience, we recognize that suffering is continuous. One suffering befalls us after another, and that there are times when suffering seems to pour down on us like rain. And that this process has no end in sight. And it has no end in sight because the causes are continuously accumulated and not being eliminated. And these causes are that as long as we have these physical and mental aggregates that have come about in dependence on the contaminated karma that we accumulated by our own afflicted minds, we will suffer. We will continue to suffer. Sometimes the suffering that beings experience is overwhelmingly obvious to everyone. At other times it's slight, just mental discontent and lack of peace of mind. But it's always there. And that the root cause of all suffering is the ignorance of self-grasping. This consciousness that misapprehends phenomena and believes them to exist in a way that they do not, where there is a discord between appearance and reality. This ignorance, particularly in relation to the self, the ignorance of self-grasping, is the reason for all suffering within samsara. In our class yesterday afternoon, there I presented the technique used in this text to generate love and compassion. Now, we're going to move to the third of the three causes to generate bodhicitta, how to generate the altruistic attitude of universal responsibility. Coming to the eighth verse. Born into cyclic existence that has no end, tormented by the three sufferings without respite, thinking of the plight of all mother beings who are in this very situation, generate the supreme altruistic intention to become enlightened.
Digi yane yado yanchi kabrele dunjole kiawana, kable nyawa kiawana, kable mili kal hale kiawana. Di yangma jinen dusino kora kido gidi ne kowale kine tarya gyune mede mumeba, zoya gyune mede kiawalengi yorasor mume shide. Chisa dine zada kiawalenbe kable da dunga nyoya da chaba duji dunga nyoya da dine gyue dunga nyoya lo dunga pato meba nyoya doge dine ki mumeba sivshin de and dati as a koaliki dati logashi kigre dine kiayo marasan dine yo mareser. Chasa koaki gyudi mapampa inna and Gidina Siba Kishin Kiawar, Tade Kiaware, Mahobani Kiri, Zoya meeting Kiri, Esorda, Mame Siba Kishin Kiawar, Tinigi, Duchin, Semgentiki, Dini Koale, Koaki, Gudi Mabamba in the Nisniamane Dadibadu, Koakiaware, and the new Koalaki, Zohama, Tinikidina, Dikan Kidures, Chisnakin, Duano, do Hasenbe, Dunidusin, Jebachi or Jebachi, do some dambo, Esor.
Looking at the first line, born into cyclic existence that has no end. So this continues from the seventh verse. So these two verses are read together. Building then on what has been looked at, we recognize that until the causes for uncontrolled rebirth in cyclic existence are completely eradicated, beings will continue to take uncontrolled rebirth in samsara. And if our recognition of the sufferings of samsara is slight, this line will have not much impact on us. But to the extent we have come to recognize the sufferings of samsara and its causes, this will have a profound impact on us. This will potentially have a profound impact on us. In that we come to recognize that each and every ordinary being is always in danger of their life ending right now and uncontrolled rebirth being taken in any of the realms of samsara. And especially if one has meditated in depth, one will recognize all the realms of samsara as suffering. There'll be lower and upper realms, but they'll all be suffering realms. And every being is constantly living with the danger that death and great suffering can befall them in any moment.
Dunga sumyu gyunche mebar narra sede. Chesanda kowa le kewa lempa ne dunga nyoya meba ne da gaya mara kewa le na digorwa. Ne dene mare che. Chesan kowa le ya kewa le gedi ina kewa lempa ina. Ane kowa kewa le chinche la dunga sumyu gyunche meba che. Da gyunche Gabriel ya dunga teo sioba che ya chik dawa kashi dunga nyoya che. Den dawa kashi ya dunga meba kiwo shu shu na ya dine digiro. Stagaro shua dine mares kizina the dunga sumet Gabriela dunga ligre Gabriela yan gyue dunga ligor Gabriela ete kyawa duju dunga sede gyuncheyo mares cheza dunga sum 옛날에 dunga 옛날에 gyunche meba gedina koala ki chinjela dunga sum gidi gyunche meba dunga nardu gorese dushi dine nargu du dine yungdu sembe dushi 심주 제제 dushi dine doa sembe das 제바 제제 되니게 dunga yobada 하고 와제 오래시래.
Second line, tormented by the three sufferings without respite. This is the situation that we find ourselves in as well as all beings. And again, this line will have a level of impact on us in direct relation to our realization of suffering and its causes. Because we all recognize suffering, but we also have the belief that we have better periods in our life. We have better days than others. We have maybe a better period of time than others. And whilst this is true, there is a degree of degree of relativity between more intense and less intense suffering. If we have really reflected well on suffering and its causes, we will recognize that even when the causes of suffering is not manifest and things appear to be going well and we're having a good time, in its very nature of our experience and ourselves, there is suffering. And not only do we experience suffering on subtle levels at all times, so too do we always abide with the risk of our situation becoming intolerably worse. And this is continuous for all beings as long as they remain chained by their own afflictions into the suffering realm of samsara.
dunga se de dunga yimba ngo sungor hago gorwa dunga de dan dunga se de dunga sungor digi sungor da pene khala sa da sowa digi yo da ten chamjan de dewa yong de de so jidin benale dewa re se ma dunga de se mi da go mare dan chöchö she yo de de le min dunga se mi da go 그래서 콜로 규에 동안라야 돼 가르스는 그 내가 대화쯤이네 템보메바 남산 규르진 디젤 남산 동안실이 거 그래서 그 대화를 해야 돼 이내 대화 중세 마대스마도요 마 템보요 마 남산 규르쇼쇼지 디젤에 동안래서 콜민 규에 동안하셔야지 다디 규에 동안에 가지고 지된다 동안이 뭐신 거 말해 그래서 나 차바듯이 동안해야 돼 아주 속이 풍보들이 레다 녀모 텔레야 차바듯이 동안래 거 진짜 레다 녀모 옹게 주위 동안래 진짜 동아이 영야다 규위 동아 영야게 시조데 가를 땐 리고서 아주 풍보되어 봐서 텔레든 리거래 진짜 아주 풍보코는 규디 레다 녀모 중앙자 그 풍보디 규야고 매봐서 그런 거 뭐래 그래서 야고 매팅이지 진짜 남산 균 초라 저쇼쇼 균 쇼쇼쇼 내나서 중초쇼 차되어와 되네자 그 될 양은 풍부되라 차바도 주동하세요 진짜 되네자 당 아주 밀리나라 할래나라 차바도 주동 풍부되게 되나 요요 바래 내 가브리엘이야 안 유유동 할리고라 가브리엘이야 동아이 동할리고라 다는 가서 미다 든돌라 되네. 다 냐와바다 되네 섬다는 동아이 되게 다시 좋아해 매밖에 되나 유팅해서 차고래서 또 전에 심주 진행하는 저게 다 동아 망아 가술리기도 새벽에 냐와바세 되가 통화해봤을 때는 냐와발레 동아 되네 든돌라 되네 용 아주 밀레 동아 되네 용도와 다 유 동아 영화에게 돼 아주게 갑레 야갑 대화 제와데 가는 템부 두에 민도 제와시네 어디 민도 남사 대화 지어 주면 남사야 규르시야 동아리 용도 때 템부미도와 안 대소 영야 가르텔린 것은 당아도 류텔했던 리기도와 류디 가르선 델했던 영화서 류디 코론을야 안 가디나 나저 규르쳐줘 때스네 칼라사다 말이나 나쳐줘 안데 아직 죄다든데 사회에서는 되어서 말해봐야 야 나쳐줘 되네 강아 쳐줘 류디 되네 베직 견 주셔서 지지지래도와 제자디 템부 균에 미든 매간지 견 되니게래샤 새벽에다디 두치나 삼다디 나둥아 숨기 날수 삼다세디 되니게 제바 제제 되니게 내수도 하고 봐 제고래서 그래.
By this point, one should have already reflected well on the three sufferings, and therefore, reading the second line, tormented by the three sufferings, one will have a vivid understanding of suffering. And of the three sufferings, the first suffering of physical and mental pain, beings already know have an experience of what this is. No one wants to suffer physically, nor mentally. So the general physical and mental suffering that we experience is included here. The second type of suffering, this is not even recognized, and in fact sounds quite surprising in society, the suffering of transient happiness. Because transient happiness is the happiness that ordinary beings strive for. It's the pleasures that we experience in samsara, but from a perspective of someone coming to understand the nature of the reality of samsara, and wanting to give rise to a wish for liberation, they will recognize that this happiness, this too, is in the nature of suffering. And this is because not only the causes that have led to this happiness are tainted with afflictions, but this happiness that we've desired so and now are experiencing is transitory. It's not just in the sense that it changes moment by moment, but in almost no time it ends. We know this from our own life, a lived experience. Every feeling of pleasure, slight or great, has ended. Every bit of good news, every welcome experience has ended. When we look closely, we see how quickly it changes. And thereafter, not only does new suffering come our way, but we suffer due to yearning, missing for that previous moment of happiness, or that previously attained happiness. And then we mistakenly apply our time and energy to try and achieve something so fleeting again. And in this way, being stayed, deceived and confused. So this is why the second type of suffering, suffering of transient happiness, is recognized as suffering. And the reason that we experience the suffering of physical mental pain and the suffering of transient happiness is due to the third type of suffering, that of all-pervasive conditioning. What that means is, as long as we have this body and mind, these physical and mental aggregates, we have the basis for suffering. As long as we have aggregates, body and mind, that has come about in dependence on contaminated karma accumulated by afflictions, our body and mind is in the nature of suffering. The very nature of our body and mind has at its essence a flaw, a fault. And that is, it was accumulated, mixed with, the causes were mixed with the afflictions. And therefore the nature of our body and mind has this fault. And this means we will, as long as we have these aggregates, we will continue to experience suffering, physical and mental pain, as well as that of transient happiness. And here, we can readily recognize this Even when our mental state is calm and peaceful, our mood can so easily change. Based on a small event, a small frustration, our peace of mind can be lost. Likewise, when we are in good health, unexpectedly, illness can befall us. And this we know from our own experience. And that illness, even when we experience it, it doesn't mean, again we know this from our experience, that this is necessarily, as we're experiencing it right now, is as bad as it may get. It may well get worse. And even when we're healing, a further illness may come. And this we know from our own lived experience. And this is all because we have this basis of contaminated aggregates. And as long as we have this basis of contaminated aggregates, this third suffering experiences will continue to befall on us without end.
Dene zada nga juge chawa tu dunga se de socio pumbo de da dene gi ina da di gyu kharel ten chungare sa ti yaya gi gyul pha simju che da gyul pha simji gore gyul pha simji che de di nga zu pumbo juye di nga zu su pumbo de kan st du gu se ne chen gyu le da nyomo ba le da le la ten du gore den nyo de nyomo ba la ten li gore le da nyomo ba de li du 나다 레다 녀마 바니데 가르리고레 세데 나아주 당보가 세방아 라싱이 두바 짐바 다세 마릭바 디 옌제네 나진디기 안 나세베 소스가 레가 나세베 나진지기 나진디기 나리아 안에 가서레 디고후도 세베 차와게 디왕게레사야다 안에 야직 나스기도 나지고 나를 그 뉴기도 세네 안에 될 파셔도 콩로게 디왕게레사야 du chene ngazin del ta cheza le da nyomma diyan zo ngazin del li du ngazin del pha che ba che ngazin ngo chhe ba che ta ngazin de ngo chhe de ta ngazin de mone ko samba na shin de ta ta rig de min du ko pang me ba so ya du ye min du che ba che de ngazin de yu de kan jing nga se kan jing go se ne lo ya nga de nang yu de kan nang go se nga se de pa nang du ka bla ka la ye ma de ba rang ngwe ni drup de hen ji nang go re che 다디 나와 나신 두에 민도 제바 두 심주 체도 되는 나와 싸우기 매바 통거래. 제가 강라에 맞도 강라에 랑원의 주변 동바세 통에도 동방이 도거라. 동바에 통거래. 동방이 통자 동방이 도도 안 되지. 나세 랑원 나와 나 짐바디 다신 로시 임바 노시 임바데 세부 하고 거래. 그 세부 임바 하고 해도 제가 동방이 도베 로디기 가야마 동상 도베 로디기 곰바이나 다zen marik badi meba sugiyo bad hago tu gorda di hago tu oda dazen marik badi pang tu du 제가 다시 말을 뻥빠나 될때 녀모 기에면도 대 녀모 맞게 봐있나 되네 레앙한 바사야면도 레앙한 바마서는 풍포디 안 잡아주지 동아도 하면도 제가디 매바서 투야 두 선비게 삼 통요도 안에 그 통요도 되네기 통요도 갑라 안에 가져와서 담마 샘젠 탐제 강한 세야디 규디 데디 용구도 규디 매바서 투야도 제가 헤디 매바서기 있어 제가 헤디 건축이 규디 매바서 봐이나 안 콘도 동안을 자투고도스 제가 네 동안을 봐 콘도 동안을 매봐서 이제 콘도 코비 동안을 자야지 탈바다 탐지기 먹고 자바디 네 지기 제가 된 동안 규디 매봐서 봐는 동안여야면도 동안면은 안 되기 마도 여야면도 제가 디 유튜브 투고도 디 유튜브에 탑람도 동안세야 탑람도 딩에 하고도 제가 네 콘도를 판도 제나 지 투고도 제가 네 지인 선배게다 당네 지인 선배 삼로디 학산다 얘기를 제 공부를 내 두고래서 두 삼다에다 네 지기
We need to recognize in great detail the sufferings of samsara. Then we need to look deeper at what the causes are for suffering. Superficial causes for superficial suffering, this we know and we can observe, they're widely known in samsara. But superficial causes come from deeper causes. subtler forms of suffering, they also come from deeper or subtler causes. So in brief, if we take, say, our aggregates, the basis upon which we suffer, we have achieved these aggregates due to karma that we ourselves accumulated. That karma was accumulated under the influence of the afflictions. So therefore the karma is contaminated because it was accumulated by the afflictions. And the afflictions themselves have a cause, and that is the ignorance of self-grasping. So there's this chain of continuity. From the ignorance of self-grasping, its resulting afflictions and accumulated, contaminated karma that has resulted in every consciousness that we have, that we experience, as well as our body. So here, when we understand the sequence, that at the root is the ignorance of self-grasping, we can easily understand intellectually that should the root cause of something be eradicated, what it would otherwise lead to will cease. So as the ignorance of self-grasping is the root cause, this is where we should turn our attention. And we turn our attention there not merely to gather knowledge, but to gather knowledge, to gain experience of what is this ignorance of self-grasping, so as to see if it is possible to eradicate it. So therefore we come to investigate the ignorance of self-grasping with an inquiring mind, wondering, wanting to see for ourselves whether it is possible to eradicate. Firstly, if it's an ignorance that grasps at the self, then let's see what that ignorance grasps at. How does the self appear to us? So a sense of self appears to us as vividly real, almost as if it's something that one can touch, something that's unchanging, that's always been there. And it's unchanging and self-existent. This is how it appears to us, as unchanging and self-existent, in the sense that no matter our time of life or what we're going through, what we're experiencing, or our development in other ways, that sense of self is there, unchanging, because it exists by its own nature, its own essence. So in this way, it appears as real to us. And then we have a consciousness that apprehends the self or grasps at the self. It doesn't just appear, but we grasp at it as existing in the way that it appears. Not as an illusion, but it's existing in the way that it appears. And when something is accepted as existing in the way that it appears, this is the meaning of true. It's not false, it's true. And therefore, this can be called the ignorance of true grasping, where true means that accepting that something exists in the way that it appears. And here, as we're looking at the self, this true grasping is called self-grasping. And when we investigate to see whether the self exists in the way that it is apprehended, in the way that it's grasped at, we come to recognize that the self doesn't exist by way of its own nature or existence. Rather, it is empty of doing so. Therefore, this consciousness that grasps at the self as existing by way of its own nature is a wrong consciousness, because the self does not exist by way of its own nature. And therefore, this wrong consciousness is an ignorance, the ignorance of self-grasping. And if we can recognize in our reflection that the self is empty of existing in the way that it appears, it's empty of existing truly or inherently or by way of its own nature or essence, this is a consciousness that is in accordance with reality, unlike the ignorance. And therefore this is a consciousness of wisdom. And it's a consciousness of wisdom that is realizing the self is empty of existing in the way that it appears. Now that we can recognize, at least on the intellectual and perhaps a superficial level, that the root cause of all suffering is a wrong consciousness and ignorance, and that a consciousness in accordance with reality, a wisdom, can be cultivated by ourselves, we recognize that an end to suffering is possible. An end to suffering is possible. And not only is it possible, but it is achievable. And therefore, we recognize that we, through cultivating this wisdom, can eradicate the root cause that leads to this chain of this chain of events that lead to suffering. We can bring an end to suffering, and lasting, stable happiness can be achieved. And if it's achievable for ourselves, it is achievable for each and every sentient being. What sentient beings require is skilled and realized guides. So therefore, I will strive to spiritually develop so that I can guide beings to achieve a state of lasting happiness, and therefore fulfill my aspiration of love. I will strive to spiritually develop so that I can guide beings based on my own knowledge and experience to achieve a state freed of suffering, and therefore fulfill my aspiration of compassion. And this is where we develop special intention, or the altruistic attitude of universal responsibility.
gyurwe manamji ngasu samne sida ma sida semjen tamje rangi pama je nyongwa semjen tamje desugi dunga negap sida negap direr sam negap sida denigi semjen tamje dunga dene narsha ba dene dunga narsha jisanda dunga gyuyonda dene redwa sembedu 심주체 제바체 dene 심주체네 제바치는 dunga de yobada sebu 하고 dunga 유가르가요 yobada sebu 하고 denegi dunga gyme바소에 방야기 년보 데네 여바데 세부 하고요도 안데네 나서 삼네 데네기 내서 삼미도 오다디 둥아디 셈자데 둥아다 자다 디기 주야데 미지기 셈베게다 라사남다리 기고레세지 안도 디레다 디시 셰바나지레 이 시방 나서 삼네 디바데
Having reflected well on suffering and its causes, as one should have done previously when cultivating definite emergence, but reminding ourselves now of suffering and its causes, as well as that those causes can be eradicated, we now turn our attention to the situation of all mother sentient beings. So the third line, thinking of the plight of all mother beings who are in this very situation. This is where we generate the determination to be of greatest benefit to others.
Lobsang mebaje kanga shu shebaje chekazo tingyen dubda masin kanga seda masin dene shedi kapля to kare kanga te kare sine kanga tigor simjuche de shin lobsang mebi genza da ji kanga tigor sobe lobsang meba de la kanga tigor 통로 de ane karaso da lobsang ji mena 다 lobsang je 탑시 가르가르 열어서 lobsang je 여바데 하고 봐이나 안 오다디 콘솔 lobsang 메디 lobsang 메바디 니코 콘솔 lobsang 여바 수기 니 콘솔 강가 세긴 셈베 삼다이도 다 내지긴라도 안 가는 제거래서는 콘솔 lobsang 제거로 봐다 소소 lobsang 제발라 니 강가 세긴라도 소소 lobsang 제발 소소 lobsang 신고로 봐 안디 나시 당에 셈제 탐지게 동아 세기 셈제듯이 디기 두기 랍도 다 심지어 dunga se da digi dubda de ganis dugo lamna 총 갑지 Joyous 가요 말에 아니 고 왕식 베지 다에 줘요 말에 난 가려 와서는 콘솔야 롭종제 바장주 dunga 되네 용구도와 제가 dunga 세게 탑람 되네 공고고래 되네 제거 dunga 디 탑람 디 냠네 제나 dunga 디세 두고래 지난 디기 주비를 유디네데 사고래 유디네 사바나 아니 디기 주 투고래 새벽에 콘솔에 탑람 띵고 그래 다 탑람 땡발라 다 소소게 탑람 땡야데 다 소소 싱도미도 소소 마시나 현在탑람 땡 두마라와 지난 소소 싱바치 고고 그래 지난 디네 인자 당이 탑람 땡바데 나랑게다데 네 지고 슬럽데 당 나랑야 뉴바도 스tam다데 뉴바 민도 지난 디네 인자 다 디네게 탑람 지다와 신도 땡 두근 뉴바 예hen 술로도스 상계세도 상교고 토고도 세데 상교고 토고도 세데 토고도 샘베게 삼로 디네리 용거래 디네 인자 샘제 탐지게든 상교고 토벌쇼 지긴 세베다 샘게 디네리 용거다 제상이 샘제 탐지게도 상교고 마토바인다 샘제 둥아세야단 디기 두야라 두투 제투고 민도 제상 콘소 니 디기 세고도 디기 두고도 네 동안 세고도 대장할이야 차견이 가르고서 나랑 당보 상지고 토고도 세상 나랑 신고도 나랑 연된 개발전에 된바 랑기 귀엔 탐제단 자와 연된 탐제 된바도 쇠고도 디쇠 차내 되는 게 콘절이야 랑기 냠용 토네 콘절이야 롭된지 시 냠는 제조 또 세나는 게 강세 투도 대장 네 당보 나랑 삼제 탐제도 상지고 토고도 선배 되네 그 선배 Samchan Tamjidun Sanyo Kopa Tobar Jigi, Sembes Tobar Showa, Sembeki, and Semki Diki Horejil. Then Nansu Samne, Semcho, Yapar Tsu, said Dura Semchik.
Having reflected well then on suffering and its causes, to the extent that one has done so, love and compassion arise. When that reflection has been done in a profound depth, a strong determination to be of benefit to others will arise, especially to benefit them in the most meaningful of ways. And this then comes about in the fourth line. I'll read the last two together. Thinking of the plight of all mother sentient beings who are in this very situation, generate the supreme altruistic intention to become enlightened. So the fourth line is where one develops the altruistic attitude of universal responsibility. And this again is when one has generated great love and compassion for beings, wanting them to experience a lasting state of happiness through accumulating those causes, and in order to do so, to eradicate all suffering through eliminating those causes. And that's the compassion element. Here, though, one develops it beyond a mere aspiration, how wonderful it would be, may it be so, to I will bring it about. And not only I will bring it about, but I take the situation of each being as my personal responsibility. That each being achieves for themselves a state of lasting happiness, I take it as my responsibility, my personal responsibility. This then is where one develops the altruistic attitude of universal responsibility. To make this clear then, think of an analogy. If one perhaps has visited another country where there are a lot of uneducated people, perhaps they're illiterate, and you see how limited their life is due to illiteracy, compassion will naturally arise for you, wanting them to be freed of this cause of their suffering. And love will arise, wanting them to experience the benefits of being freed of that suffering. And so that arisal of love and compassion for their situation, and it comes about in dependence on recognizing the cause. But if that love and compassion is strong, you won't just leave it at a mere aspiration. Oh, how wonderful it would be. Maybe get annoyed that the government hasn't done anything about it. But rather you take it as your responsibility. You've recognized that beings are suffering, and you've recognized the reason. And you say to yourself, actually, I can do something about this. I can do something about this. And then you apply yourself to accumulating the specific causes. Wagging your finger, complaining, using your authority, that's not going to do anything on its own. Selling specific things, that too won't do anything on its own. You recognize the required causes, which is based on education. That education needs to be shared. And that is how uneducated people can become educated, and they can overcome this problem and achieve some happiness. And therefore you go about setting up the required organization and educating people. So in the same way here, the aspirant bodhisattva has recognized the suffering situation of all mother sentient beings, and has recognized the reasons why they are suffering, and that there is a solution. And they then develop this determination to be the person that guides all sentient beings in the eradication of their causes of suffering and the accumulation of the causes that will lead to happiness. They take that as their responsibility. But in order to fulfill that responsibility, they recognize they themselves need further education, and that education needs to be further integrated within themselves. Because there's limits to the aspirant bodhisattva's wisdom, and therefore there are limits to how skillfully they can interact with beings. Because they recognize that beings, there's a wide variety in terms of karmic backgrounds and individual spiritual dispositions amongst beings. And to benefit each one in the most appropriate way, the aspirant bodhisattva has to eradicate their own ignorance. So therefore, they commit to becoming the most skilled of guides, a Buddha. And they do so not for their own benefits, but so that they can fulfill their aspirational love and compassion, and bring that about in reality. So therefore they commit to striving to develop ever more knowledge, or acquire ever more knowledge, and integrate that knowledge within themselves, transform their way of thinking. Knowing that whilst they're going through this process of developing knowledge and gaining experience based on that knowledge, they will be able to, from right now, be of ever greater benefit to others, and already start enacting their love and compassion. So this is how the altruistic attitude of universal responsibility is generated, and that is the meaning of our fourth line: generate the supreme altruistic intention to become enlightened.
xie dang ya chi la bo sam ben so so ge xie dang xin gu lo so so xie dang xie so so ge xie dang ta nyam nyong to ne ma me ba ne xian li ya xie dang ya la xin ma de ji sa ane je mo chi la bo sam ben ne cham tha ya dan je mo la ge ne so so ge di xin gu go le di ma xin ba ne la tu ya ma de dang an de gi ru ji la bo sam na so so ge gi di xin gu go de ma xin ba ne xian la tu ya me ba ji sa dang an zo kar ne mo ba ne xian li ya ane Shabro Chapkin Labgin said, Labgin Chicken Sibdu, so the Shabro Jango Jando Chikura. Monbananga Shed, I mean, Shell Lapche, Dusan Shala, D. Lapkin Chicken Sibi, some Tamane, and Sosuran She Jando Chikur. Dinashin, Ganda Kaina, Shalia, Labiala, Sosugi Labiala, Sosugi Shinche, Sosu Nyamya Yawache, Dinilabana Shalia, Manova, Tata Laptugurua, Sosugi Yapumashing by Nene, Laptuya Yomar. 对新白呢，俺这不打过的亚过了，马新闻呢，俺这车上亚过就拉推也买了哇。今天现在俺这个指定比较话，看这些呢，现在那边个也给你叫我上班的，现在的那个工作的新白就说我上班呢，所以个拉讲多少钱，年苗有吧就，但俺这个指定那有吧搞的，但全年吃过了哇，别的那些人，但是现 Dunga Sealia, Samla Denis Tangore, Digitubiala, Samla Denis Tanji, Tukure City, Malabiala, Sosu Tampo Nyamyo, Sosu Shingo, Sosu Sosu Nyamyo Betone, or Dusine, Consul Lavana, Panto Chimbo Tukur, Dimena, Tutu Mevara, Dinenza, Sosu Nyamyo, the Shinya, the Yapochayala, San Yokovadi, Tokudu, Saji, San Yokovan, Matopnada, that. Controlling opposite love to Samara and big Jim Mijisa Yokoba, Toku Sembligua, depending on the Jane Chamber Cheva, Torn Lap like Zenji, Martin by Neta, may love to marriage, just like the negative temperature Google SMB University Term temperature Google SMB some time, the engine Mijam was and some Ligua, Bedina Chiguarda.
this process that I've laid out, you all know from your own lives, because this is the process adopted in society as well. For example, if you can sing beautifully, and you'd love to be a singing instructor, and perhaps you already are, and you want to teach your students a particular song, you have to know that song first, and not just know it intellectually, you need to be a bit skilled in singing it well, so that you can teach your students. Similarly, if one enjoys a sport, perhaps a particular sport, and one aspires to become either a sports person or a coach of that sport, one knows you have to be really skilled at it. It's not enough merely to have watched it on television. You have to be skilled in that sport, and not only skilled in that sport, skilled in how to teach it. So therefore, one needs experience based on knowledge. Likewise, if one has a particular love of if one has a love of a particular academic field, and one has the yearning to spend one's life immersed in that academic field, it's likely one will enjoy talking about this particular academic field. So one may then have the aspiration, I'd love to work as a university lecturer teaching this topic. So one has this aspiration, and one can see the benefit that would come to others, but then one has to gain knowledge in that topic, and deep knowledge in that topic, as well as skill in communicating it. With either of those aspects lacking, one will be a pretty useless lecturer, and one's students will not benefit. So therefore, in the Dharma and in society, if one is going to guide others, it's indispensable that one has experience based on knowledge.
다 내내기 자주 심게 고래서 심제 담시 선유고 화토쇼 심배 자주 심게 다 자주 심게 받음게 선유고 톱 투그레선 투고 말에 지다다 심제 담시 선유고 톱을 지인선에 자주 심게 어디 다 선유고 톱발이야 냠len 가르치고 그래서 다디 릉아이 순예제 되면 추림 소야다 안에 쇠배 냠len지야 진배 냠len지야 추림 냠len지야 네 쇠배 냠len 준지 냠len 네 삼대 삼기 냠len 동방이 또 배셔라 냠len지 제자 80주기 냠len지 자고 디네장에 심지어 담주 산유고방 토바 지기 산유고방 토비 치도 니 80주기 냠len데 지기 세배게다 디네게 켈렌제제 될야 80주기 냠len데 라 장도를 지고 그래지래
Having trained in this way, first through definite emergence, and then applying this attention to others, generating love and compassion, and thereafter, the altruistic attitude of universal responsibility, and thereby bodhicitta, one now has overwhelming determination to spiritually transform in order to be of ever greater benefit to others. So therefore, one has a strong determination to engage in the activities of a bodhisattva, because these are indispensable for training one's mind. The ethical restraint of restraining one's physical and verbal behavior through restraining one's mind, generosity, patience, joyous perseverance, concentration, and wisdom. All of these one makes great endeavor now to train one's mind in.
나는 저기 추림 순고에 대해 가르려나 나는 저기 류가 유스미에 대해 예제 대비 추림 마송바이나 아니 소소기라 아니 지게 류가 유스미에 예제 망고서는 디바사고 제가 디바 방마도 맨날 아니 나는 저기 산적고 봐 투투야요 말 제가 디네서 류가 유스미 예제 대비 추림 순고에 대해 소소기라 녀몽바 마기야 추림 소야지 산적고 봐 투베치도 제가 디나시 소수의 예주 등비 수준 수마도 번에 현래 판도 제도 말로 가서 소수의 칸에 봐샤리아 특수시하다 준시하다 아니 제가 제발나 现在偏不住土嘛了，现在牛把嘛都偏不住土嘛，旅游过呢，现在要东亚当刚刚这些边呢，第呢现在偏高嘛，牛高了吧，其实俺最接的，俺怎么讲呢？偏不住也个。东汉三个段大上有个话，突然几个这个了。第一章所说的研究对面处理进去送，所说的也落了，把讲到了现在，本来另外艺术面可能想了，那边叫我找几个面身边上了的样呢样都当起讲到些这个，做人呢做这个人是呢。让这种三八三的早可能解决没身边什么这些，可是呢，我就刚刚忙我就开始让这种他们说，我让说让结巴今年，俺呢，俺的那个都，俺的军用都，俺的主民都是，今年现在俺看着见的，俺那个说的对现场见看着见的，要么见的那个，其实让这种三八可能解决没身边个。samdha ne shen jebar zimbe san rang je zungi sabla ya shen jebar zimbe sam shen le digi du na shen ya bu chuna shen yi don da le yang ha kale gep na gep gins ngal ya gyen ju na ka kheba min do sam be sam du chen rang je zungi pa lo de dor chen shen jebar zimbe sam je san churim song ji de lyunga yi sum ye de be nye ju ge churim song ya rang je zungi sam ba song ya de ge da di ga lobchang je ya de ga zo de ne ge ne sam lo na du chen jang du je go le je de.
The ethical restraint of body, speech and mind, or to express it differently, the ethics of restraining one's body, speech and mind. This is an indispensable training for all Buddhists, and of course for Bodhisattvas too. The Bodhisattva will train in the ethics of restraining their body, speech and mind through recognizing that even slight non-virtue impedes one's spiritual progression. Moreover, even slight non-virtue brings harm to others, and bringing harm to others is contrary to the aspiration they've given rise to benefit others. So with this understanding, a bodhisattva will be determined to restrain their mind from the afflictions and keep the mind virtuous. And in this way, their physical and behavior too will be restrained. And in particular, a bodhisattva who's a highly developed being will recognize that the primary cause of all the problems that they experience, as well as the problems they bring into the lives of others, is their self-cherishing mind. The self-cherishing mind we can understand as the thought of, I want, I don't want. And from this attachment to the I want comes, and I don't want comes. And not only then with this attachment, this affliction that leads to their therefore afflicted behavior, anger also follows. And then we speak to others in a harsh manner. We take advantage of others. So Bodhisattva's primary training in ethics is guarding against the self-cherishing mind, and in its place cultivating the other cherishing mind. This is done through valuing others, the happiness of others, before their own happiness. And the Bodhisattva trains in taking great delight in fulfilling the needs of others and ignoring their own wishes and wants. This way helps them train to keep their primary focus on benefiting others and not being overcome by their own self-obsession, their own self-interest.
제 강함에가 소수기 튕긴 샤니야 로버치야라 튕게 가라이나 상황치 고고로봐 제가 내내기 튕긴 상황 요약이 규디가 저기 진배념내 제야데 자고래 제가 샤레 진배 소수기 진배념내 제야디 뭐한바나 소수기 생기 된주벨에 튕긴 가리 토네 로버치나 로버치 투약이 뉴바디 튕기 요바디 두야리아 아니 진배념내 제 제가 소수기 난 이제 생기 동아세야다 디기투빌에 샤레 로치에다 샤레 직도시네 튕긴기 자체 팬바주마도네 현지 판주에 매번 쭉 가고 지원자 대인자는 아주 디 진미념의 제화 다 쇠비 냠네 제와 가르람나 땅하나 주기 다 소수기 현이 된 개체 무주베라 아니 강아 망부용고와 진짜 강아 델리레요도 갑려야 델리야 서버 콤바토베나 아니 지게 셈주 자야다 아니 지게 콘라야다 된체베나 아니 현이 된 두고 말에 아니 소수기네 뉴바차산 상투고 말 진짜 지시 마오바나 소수기 현이 된 두도 갑려 강아 같이 있나 델리야 아니 동len제 투야다 아니 지게 셈쇼 맞아봐 디용에게 셈 캡도 쳔모기야리아 만주다드네 삼론나라 수베냠네 제야디 예치모지오레스 제산 수베냠네 제바나 마오바나 소수기 셈 닝도티바 직시 오징도 쳔벌레 안데네 레바자 시엘레 판도 주야레 누가 쳔모용고레스 판도 쳔모용고레스 대자 수베냠네 제오리 예치모레스.
Generosity too is a greatly important training for a bodhisattva. Take the illustration of material generosity. The bodhisattva will look at the material possessions they have and think to themselves, what I have, I can utilize to benefit others, either directly or indirectly. And actually, now that I have developed this sincere aspiration to become a Buddha for the sake of others, I can commit that whatever I will attain in the future, I will attain. As I'm attaining it through my virtuous attitude, I will utilize this solely to benefit others, directly or indirectly. And in fact, the bodhisattva may ask herself, actually, as a bodhisattva, other than using my material goods to be of benefit to others, why do I need them? I only need these to benefit others, directly or indirectly. The third training is that of patience. And patience is of supreme importance for a bodhisattva. As with ethical restraint, patience attitude is concordant with the bodhisattva's outlook. If the bodhisattva is not ethical or patient, they are acting in a way that's contrary to their determination, which is to benefit others in the most meaningful of ways. So therefore, a bodhisattva will be very clear that anger and frustration, these only bring harm to oneself and others, and they're contrary to their aspiration. And moreover, they impede their spiritual development and thereby their ability to be of ever greater benefit to others. So therefore, in dependence on their strong love and compassion, bodhisattvas are patient with all the harm they experience from others or the inner frustration that they feel. And they readily are able to overcome such afflictions.
강함에바 냠는 제투와 중고로와 지상도 레로 세디 다지 지게 진이 마쳐바 다 델리아 지진이 마쳐 제마디와 제고스베 딘데 레로 제투바나 가지고 기회 자와 좀 자와디 두야리아 안 레로 제투반 자와디 두고 말 자와도 냠는 마제바나 딘데 단다 두고 말 대상 가지고 존주이 냠는 제고 지상 기회 자와 딘데 주에 빼 야보래 고감 야보래 딘데 야보래 삼제 델리아 가신 쪼신 거 봐. The
fourth training is that of joyous perseverance, which in brief is taking delight in virtue. The bodhisattva in particular will take delight in ethical restraint, delight when they are preventing the arisal of their self-cherishing mind, delight in seeing their spiritual development in this way. They'll take delight in their practices of generosity, in the development of this generous attitude, this attitude of giving of themselves to others. Similarly, they'll take delight in their patient attitude, that when they are experiencing hardship from others or from their own inner turmoil, seeing that their attitude is subdued, that their mind is remaining unafflicted, and thereby they are only responding in a helpful way, no matter what harm they receive, they'll take delight in this. Taking delight in virtue also includes taking delight in studying and meditating. And therefore, whenever obstacles come to receiving teachings or meditating on those teachings, the Bodhisattva will joyously overcome those obstacles and see these as obstacles to be overcome. Because the Bodhisattva recognizes the grave danger that laziness presents them, laziness presents the danger of the Bodhisattva being distracted from their path of spiritual development. Laziness presents the danger of the Bodhisattva's priorities being altered and rather prioritizing what is not so important. And forgetting that the most important thing is their continued spiritual development and their expression of that in terms of benefiting others.
냠렌제 곰 자고래시데 당한도 곰 자산텔라 지오곰나 주홈시아지 이용고래 제상한도 신내 당보 제바치 둥아 당을 뒤에 삼당나데 가르치고 그러서는 진짜 샘전 양한도 둥아 간에 용구도 세베 둥아 가르가르도 세베 둥아 파 용나데 파 제바치 심주시 단 가신 둥아 간에도 디네티 간에 용구도 둥아 파 용나데 파 제바치 다 동아디게 용사데 가왈리도 senang 저게 밀레나 둔로나 가르나 차상도수 용도 와서 다 동아 용에게 규디다 용바에는 규디가 느끼기도 세베 규를 심주치데 규레다 녀모 봐서 도스네도 심주치데 규디게 하고 다 규디 하고데 규디 매바서에게 두면도 쇠투고리면도 델레 녀보 가르팅고도 디 매바서네 녀보 가르팅고도 세베 도 심주치에도 녀보 다음에 또 베시랍 동반이 또 베시랍세야지 어디 공고도 선배기 통여도 되네 고매봐 써야지 세버 통여도 다 되네 인자 다 semje 탐지기 동안 매봐서 두고도 진짜 동안 매봐서 두고도 동안 매봐서야 탑도 탑람도 딩에 하고 구도 대상의 통성 제산 딩에 semje 탐지 동안을 잡아도 내치기 아니 거리 동안을 제시 디기 딩이 되와 토바도 내치기 선배게 다 화사 남다도 두신의 삼실이 난데는 내 지기스도 당에 제발라 말하는 연된 디고도 제사 디인산 데 술로도 탐지 균 차상한 제와 연단 차자 상화도 술에서는 상예세야 되셔서 제사 디인에서 상여고 토벌 지기 세배 자주 셈게 네데 데네 셈게야지 제사 당에 상여고 토벌라 안들라 다 롭좀 가르치고 그래서는 냠내 가르치고선 데네 이 진바다 수련을 쇠바도 준주기 데데 삼대 되게 발전 중에 냠내기 지긴 새벽 도치네 삼다제 나도체 심주제 되네 삼다 되네 삼다는 거 중에 대한 안진버 출전수버 전주기 딩에지 시럽이야 랑고소 라른다데 다 냠내제 디차고래 세상 아주 디리쇼게 that 롭산디기 도체 삼다데 다 양답에 따와서 되는 거 제일 셰디 발전 중에 나네 셰르게 발전이 된다 안 딩에지 세디게 다 양답에 따와는 마시르 고래
All these varying stages of meditation that have been presented thus far, of the two types of meditation, placement and analytical, these are included in analytical meditation. And ideally these should be done with placement meditation too. But just to briefly recap what we've been looking at these analytical meditations, we need to look at, firstly, our own situation in terms of this precious human rebirth and its impermanence. And also then, building on that strength of mind that reflection leads to, we need to, with great vigor, look at the suffering nature of cyclic existence, at both the breadth of suffering that we experience, as well as on the subtler levels, the subtle levels of our suffering, and thereafter the causes of suffering. Naturally then, our mind will turn to what can be done about this, especially when you recognize the causes. And there we reflect on the antidote, the wisdom realizing selflessness, or the wisdom realizing emptiness. We need to see there, is this something I can do? Am I following? Am I understanding? Can I do this? And we will see that there is a solution and we can apply it. We can achieve the result of this solution. It is not beyond any of us. Then we take this understanding of definite emergence and we apply it to all others, recognizing they're in the same position. and we think about this in great detail, generating love and compassion for them. When that love and compassion is generated in a powerful manner, we take responsibility for their situation. We don't leave it to others to resolve. We have the capacity to eradicate suffering for ourselves. Therefore, we have the capacity to go beyond individual liberation and become Buddhas. We have the capacity thereby to benefit others in the most meaningful of ways. With this recognition, based on powerful love and compassion, we generate the altruistic attitude of universal responsibility. And with this, we set the determination to become a Buddha. And in order to become a Buddha, one must train in the activities of a bodhisattva, namely generosity, ethical restraint, patience, joyous perseverance, concentration, and wisdom. This afternoon, then, we will continue in the text and we will come to the remaining two, that of concentration and the correct view. So thank you. We'll leave it there for this morning and we'll continue again this afternoon.